Okay, so here's the big picture. So a lot of growth and innovation, especially in e-commerce, is driven by data, particularly data about consumers. So in as much as we care about growth and innovation, we want consumers to be comfortable when their data is out there. Of course, we all know consumers are increasingly concerned about their privacy. They're worried about their data being out there. It's just from a recent Pew survey, 90% of the participants expressed some sort of a strong or very strong privacy concern. So one relevant question is, how should we think about the trade-offs between wanting to maintain people's privacy, consumers' privacy, but nonetheless getting them to share information? And the main tool we have to deal with these trade-offs is privacy policies. Okay, so the basic question is, how do different privacy policies affect both the level of privacy protection and the level of information sharing, okay, and the welfare of the consumers? So if you want a particular example to have in mind where this is especially salient, so think about online social networks. So people share photos, they share their location, all sorts of fun things that people apparently do on Facebook. But even online social network users have privacy concerns, okay, 80% in this Pew survey. Okay, and Facebook has responded to privacy concerns, and consumers have responded to their response, and so on. Okay, so there are other applications of this model, but this is just something salient to keep in mind. It's the running example that I'm going to use. Okay, so in this paper, what I'm interested in is trying to figure out what conditions on the interaction determine whether privacy enhancements are beneficial and when they're harmful, both to consumers and to network owners. Okay, and here are just a sample of the kinds of questions that we'll be asking. So for example, are privacy enhancements necessarily beneficial to consumers? Okay, so they care about their privacy, but is it good to give them privacy? Can these policies be advantageous also to the network owners, who presumably don't care as much about privacy, but maybe they care about maximizing the amount of information that's shared on the network? Okay, are there situations where actually you want to minimize privacy protection? This is good for everybody, consumers and the network owner. Okay, and finally, is it a good idea to let consumers themselves choose whether or not their privacy is protected in some sense? Okay, so these are the answers. Okay, so here are some high-level takeaways from this paper. So the paper basically highlights two effects of privacy enhancements. There's the direct effect. Okay, so enhancing privacy is good because these consumers care about their privacy. There's also an indirect effect. The indirect effect is, well, if you change the privacy setting, you're changing the interaction, so you're changing the amount of information that consumers share. Okay, it's the amount of information that I share, it's also the amount of information that my peers share, and that also affects utility. Okay, so this drives an indirect effect on the utility of the consumers. Okay, and it turns out that different privacy enhancements might have different effects on the volume of information sharing. Some will increase it, some will decrease it. Okay, and so they'll have different indirect effects on user welfare. Okay, and here's a little cutesy kind of punchline. Even though privacy enhancements seem beneficial to non-strategic users, so users who just think about the direct effect, they don't think about how this affects others' behavior, so it seems beneficial, but they may be harmful if users are strategic. Okay, so the idea that privacy enhancements can be harmful is not a new idea. There's a lot of experimental and empirical work on this, and the literature has culminated in the following statement. It's complicated. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. You know, there are lots of different trade-offs going on, so it's very context-specific. There's also a theory literature trying to analyze the trade-offs, and basically it's focused on a signaling setup. So think about individuals being one of several types, maybe a good type and a bad type, okay, and the amount of information that's disclosed, the level of privacy protection kind of changes the signaling technology of the individuals. Okay, and Posner and others basically have argued that privacy protections are going to be harmful because it allows the bad types to more easily hide the fact that they're bad types. Okay, and this is at the expense of the good types. Okay, so I want to talk about slightly different privacy concerns, ones that don't have to do with the signaling motivation. I don't want to signal that I'm a good or a bad type, but rather the fact that my information is out there in the first place, that's what's harmful. Okay, so think about users who are concerned about identity theft or stalking. Okay, I care about how much of my information is out there, not necessarily what that information says about me. So I want to give a couple examples to kind of emphasize the difference. So suppose I'm the kind of person either who likes to hang out at a bar, or I'm a type who hangs out at the library. Okay, now if I was concerned about the signaling motivation, I don't want to signal to my peers at work that I'm the bar type. Okay, but if what I'm concerned about is someone stalking me, then I'm not going to post a selfie on Facebook regardless of which type I am. Okay, it's the fact that the information is out there, it doesn't matter what it is, that's what harms me. Okay, so I call this the quantitative concern for privacy as opposed to the signaling concern. Okay, and this is what we're going to focus on here. Okay, another example is why are people so concerned about the privacy of their credit report? So of course there's a signaling motivation. If I have bad credit, I don't want creditors to know that because I won't be eligible for loans. But if I'm worried about identity theft, then even if I have good credit, I don't want my privacy report to leak. Okay, so I'd be harmed by that as well. Okay, and actually this dimension of privacy concerns, this is what people talked about in these Pew surveys when people said that they were concerned about their privacy. Okay, it's these quantitative aspects of privacy. Okay, so let me give just a preliminary formalization of how we can think about the different trade-offs. Okay, so we're going to think about this in the Facebook example. So there's a user posting photos on the platform, and apparently this is enjoyable. Okay, so he benefits from this. But there's some costs. If I post a lot of photos, then people are going to learn where I am, what I'm wearing, who I'm hanging out with, and what my daily habits are. Okay, and this might come back and harm me later on. So let's call X the amount of information that a user is sharing on the network. Okay, think about this as the number of photos, for example. And what I'm interested in is the utility of sharing an X amount. Okay, so there are various components to this. So first there's the benefit. Okay, there's a benefit, this is an enjoyable activity. The more photos I post, the happier I am. So V of X is the benefit that I derive from posting photos. Okay, so it's an increasing function. The more I share, the better. Okay, there's some costs. If my information is leaked, gets into the wrong hands, then that's going to harm me later on. So it's going to be C of X is the cost. The more information I share, the more the cost is if that information is leaked. Okay, the information might not be leaked, so let's call lambda the probability of this information being leaked. Okay, so it's a very simple utility function, so we can ask, what's the effect of enhancing privacy, in this case by lowering the probability of leakage? Okay, so one obvious ramification is the utility is going to increase, because I'm decreasing the costs. And if you think about it a little bit longer, you see that as another ramification, which is, if I'm thinking about the optimal amount of information to share, and now we're lowering privacy, the lambda parameter, we're increasing privacy, I'm going to want to share more. Right? Because the marginal cost is going to go down, whereas the benefit stays the same. Okay, so this is actually a privacy enhancement that's good for me, because it increases my welfare. It's also good for the network owner, because it gets me to share more information. Okay, this is kind of a silly example, because nobody's posting photos on Facebook for their own benefit. This kind of misses the whole collective nature of social networks. So we're going to focus on two different ways in which interaction happens on social networks, or how they affect utilities. Okay, so one aspect is the network effects. Okay, I get a benefit from posting photos, but also from looking at my friends' photos. Okay, so the way I'm going to capture it is this VI, the benefit function, doesn't just depend on how much information I share, but it's also increasing in the amount of information others share. Okay, so VI, just think about it as an arbitrary increasing function. It captures any kinds of network effects. The other force shaping interaction is interdependencies. So here's what interdependencies are about. When I post photos online, I share information about myself, but I also share information about other people. Okay, the people that are in the photos. So in particular, someone might be harmed by leakage of information about him or her that person didn't post, that someone else posted about them. Right? Information is interdependent. So just here are some examples. I mentioned photos. There's this whole idea of a shadow profile. So profiles of people on Facebook, of people who actually don't have a Facebook account. Just information that's aggregated that's been posted by their peers. Okay, so how am I going to model this? So we're going to think about the cost function as depending not just on what an individual shares, but also what other people share. Okay, increasing in everybody. And on this parameter rho, which I'm going to call the interdependence parameter. So think about rho equals 0 means there's no interdependence. When you share information, that says nothing about me. And as rho gets larger, more of your information is also about me. Okay, so here's the utility function with these collective effects. And now we can talk about two privacy enhancements. One we already mentioned, that's lowering this probability of leakage. And another one is lowering the level of interdependence. right? Because that gives each individual user more control about how much information of his is out there, because other people aren't going to share information about him. Okay, so these are the two privacy enhancements that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so what are we going to have in this paper? So there's going to be a model. I'm going to be more formal about the model, the cost function in particular. That's basically all I'll talk about today. There are also some results, which I'll just briefly sketch. Okay, so what can you show with this model? So here's one simple result, which is that both lowering lambda and lowering rho have a positive direct effect, basically because of this utility function, right? Just both of these are going to lower the costs, given everybody else's behavior. But they're actually going to have opposite effects on the volume of information sharing. Lowering lambda, as we already saw, is going to get people to share more, whereas lowering rho is going to cause people to share less. Okay, so this drives an indirect effect on user welfare, and now whether it's good or bad depends on individual utilities, right? So if other people now share more, the question is that good for me or is it bad for me? Are the benefits from the network effects greater than the harms from the interdependencies? Right, so sometimes I want people to share more, sometimes I want people to share less. Okay, so if the enhancements causes people to act in a way that I like, it causes people to share more and I want them to share more, I'm going to call that positive indirect effects. And in that case, the privacy enhancements are beneficial, okay, if the indirect effects are positive. There's the other case where the indirect effects are negative. And then we have a bit of a problem because, well, the direct effects are positive, the indirect effects are negative, and then it's just a big mess. Okay, so anything can happen. What I'm going to focus on is how does the kind of information that we're talking about affect whether the privacy enhancement is good or bad? Okay, the kind of information being, am I posting photos? Am I sharing my location? Is it genetic information? Okay, and the kind of information, I'm going to try to capture that by the interdependencies. Okay, so I'll talk about that soon. Okay, and we'll see how that affects which way the trade-off, whether the direct effect or the indirect effect dominates. Okay, and then this last point, which I'm not going to get to talk about, so I'll just mention the result, which is that if you let people choose whether or not they want to implement the privacy enhancement, you'll get a sort of paradox where they'll say, yes, if everybody has to have the privacy enhancement, then I want that. Okay, but given what everybody else is doing, if I now get to choose whether I want it or not just for myself, everybody's going to say no. Okay, so you get sort of a prisoner's dilemma sort of phenomenon with privacy enhancements. Okay, so there's some related literature, which I'll just show you the slide so you know it exists. Okay, so a little bit more details about the models. Just for the talk, let's suppose there are two users. Okay, and everything generalizes to more. Each user has a unit interval of information. Okay, they post between 0 and 1 amount of information. There's this parameter rho, and here's how the parameter rho plays a role. So if user minus I shares x minus I amount of information, then a rho fraction of that is also going to be about user I. Okay, so the total amount of information shared about user I is some function of xi, which is what user I shared about himself, and rho x minus I, which was what the other guy shared that was about him. Okay, and it's a function of those two because I haven't said anything about whether it's some of the same information or distinct information. Okay, so this AI is the aggregation function. Okay, so here are two examples that are going to play a role. So one is what I call overlapping information. So that's when the amount of information that I share about myself overlaps the information that others share about me. Okay, in that case, this aggregation function is just the maximum of the two. And another example is additive information. That's when the information that I share and that others share about me are completely distinct. And in that case, the total amount of information shared about me is the sum of the two. Okay, so now I can think about different kinds of personal information and see whether it fits better into one of these two or maybe doesn't fit either one of them. So here are some examples that maybe fit. So one is, for example, demographic information shared about you with third-party apps. This is overlapping because the demographic information I share about myself and others share about me, it's the same demographic information. For additive information, if what I care about is facial recognition technology, then my photos of me and others' photos of me are distinct because maybe they're from a different angle, different camera. Okay, so these are distinct pieces of information. Okay, and then there's some other things that maybe don't exactly fit. Okay, another aspect of this is that the information that I share about myself and that others share about me, these are substitutes. So this is the formal definition, but here's just a way to think about it. So suppose I share some amount of information, and now I look at how much new information do others share about me when they share a lot versus when they share a little. Okay, that's the left-hand side. And now suppose I share more information. I claim that that difference between the new information they share about me should go down. And the reason is I've shared more information, so some of that might overlap the difference that they had. Okay, so this is satisfied in the examples that we have. I also have a more general theorem that states precisely what are the conditions for this to hold. Okay, it's basically the conditions that are in this model. So here's the utility of the user. We already had that top line, but the green line is how we're going to plug it in. So the cost is going to depend on what everybody shares in this parameter row. It's just some function of the total amount of information about me. Okay, some Ci hat that depends on the aggregated information about a user. Okay, so the way I've presented it so far, the Vi and the Ci can be anything, so I can't really solve this model. So we could try to think about maybe a closed form for the Vi and the Ci. So I'm going to try to do something a little bit more general, which is to impose some structure on the utility function. Basically, the assumption that I need to make this tractable is that the utility functions satisfy single crossing. The way to think about this is when others share more information, then optimally I also want to share more information. Okay, that's the effect of this. Here's a formal definition. Whether or not it holds in practice, I have no idea, but at least some empirical evidence that looks at the amount of information shared is consistent with that. Okay, they found when people's friends share more, then these individuals also tend to share more. This assumption buys me a lot actually in the analysis here, because it means that the game is a game of strategic complements, which means pure Nash equilibria exist. Not only that, the Nash equilibria form a lattice, so we can talk about the maximal and the minimal equilibria. And what I'm going to do is comparative statics on these extremal, maximal and minimal equilibria. Okay, there's another assumption that I use, which is an assumption star. And I'll tell you why it's a star in a second, which is that the cost function is submodular. Here's a formal definition. Basically, this is satisfied whenever the Ci hat is not too convex. Here's what I mean by not too convex. So it depends on what the aggregation function is. So for example, if information is overlapping, then this is not an assumption, this is just true. If, on the other hand, we're with additive information, then it requires Ci hat to be concave. Okay, and more generally, if it's neither additive or overlapping, then Ci can be convex, just not too convex. Okay, so most of the paper is with this assumption, and then I have some other things that happen when Ci hat is convex, which are also kind of neat. Okay, but I'm not going to talk about them today. So let me formalize the results a little bit more. So we have the direct effect, lowering lambda or rho. These are beneficial. The extremal equilibria are decreasing in lambda and in rho, and increasing in rho. That means when I decrease lambda, then the maximal and minimal equilibria increase. If I decrease rho, they decrease. Okay, and then whether that's good or bad depends on whether utility functions are increasing or decreasing in other people's levels of sharing. So if I want others to share more, then lowering lambda has a positive indirect effect. And so I want that privacy enhancement. If it's decreasing, then lowering rho does exactly what I want, and so that's beneficial. If indirect effects are negative, right, so this is when things depend on the structure. So here are my results. So if information is overlapping, then lowering lambda is beneficial, whereas lowering rho is harmful. And it's kind of the other way around if information is additive. Lowering lambda is kind of ambiguous. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, depending on rho, whereas lowering rho is beneficial. Okay, so this is how they depend on the kind of information that we're talking about. Here's some extensions. Here's a recap. We talked about direct and indirect effects of privacy enhancements. The indirect effects being driven by the volume of information sharing. I argued that different privacy enhancements have different effects on the volume. Okay, and so they have a different indirect effect. If users only care about the direct effects, if they're not strategic, they seem beneficial. If they are strategic, then you also have the indirect effect, and so they can be harmful.